Hello, everyone. Welcome to my channel, Maggie's Tales. I'm here to share folk stories, thrilling mysteries, and all sorts of other topics. Thanks for joining me for today's story. Back in the early 1800s, in the crossroads of the little town of Pinewood, Clearwater County, a group of well-to-do folks stood huddled together. They were pointing at a run-down cabin across the street, whispering among themselves. "Did y'all see it a few days ago?" one of them asked. Maggie Tanner got sent packing back home, but her ma Susan wouldn't even let her through the door. "A real shame if you ask me," said an older woman, peering intently at the cabin. "Word's been going around for ages that she's got a cursed streak. They say she's bad luck, lost her pa and her brother, and now, not even a year later, another one's gone." "She's a pretty little thing though," chimed in a round-faced woman with a sigh of regret. "Who'd dare take a chance on her now?" "Ain't that the truth?" another replied. "But if I were Susan, I wouldn't risk it either. Living with that hard-headed girl? Might just be a death sentence waitin' to happen." The plump woman wrinkled her nose in disdain. "Mark my words, it's only a matter of time." Just then, the door of the cabin creaked open from the inside. Out stepped a young woman dressed in simple patched-up clothes. It was none other than Maggie Tanner herself. She locked eyes with the gossiping crowd and flashed a polite smile. "Well, good mornin' to you fine folks chattin' away," she said with a nod. The round-faced woman quickly swapped her frown for a friendly grin. "Mornin', Maggie. Where you headed?" Maggie brushed a strand of wind-blown hair behind her ear and smiled again. "Just off to town to sell some embroidery I've been workin' on. Gotta make a few bucks. Y'all take your time join, I'll be headin' out." The group waved her off hurriedly, watching her figure shrink into the distance. Someone muttered under their breath, "Say what you will, that Maggie's a looker. And she's got a way about her, real talent. Such a pity though." Now, let's talk about this Maggie Tanner. Poor thing's got a story that'd tug at anybody's heartstrings. She was an orphan, left to fend for herself from the get-go. Way back when, she was abandoned up on Pinewood Ridge. It just so happened that day, a local logger named Jim Tanner was out on the ridge, chopping firewood. He'd made it halfway up the slope when he heard a baby's cry cuttin' through the quiet. Following the sound, he stumbled on a little bundle tucked under a big oak tree. Jim hightailed it over there in 2 strides and scooped the baby up. Her tiny face was near blue from the cold. He glanced around, no sign of a soul anywhere. Jim wasn't one to dilly-dally in a fix like that. Forget the firewood. He hugged that baby close and bolted back home. Jim Tanner was a hard-working man, a logger through and through. Every day, he'd haul himself up the ridge, chop a load of wood, and trek into town to sell it. That's how he kept food on the table. His wife, Susan, pitched in too, doing some needlework on the side to help make ends meet. By all accounts, the two of them should have scraped by just fine with what they earned. But life don't always play fair. 3 years back, Susan had a boy born too early. Little fella was frail as could be, needin' medicine round the clock. Kept 'em both runnin' ragged. Worse still, that birth took a toll on Susan. She couldn't have more kids after that. So that sickly boy was their one and only, and they poured everything into him. Then along comes this baby girl Jim found. When he carried her through the door, Susan was stunned for a second. But quick as that shock came, her face fell. They could barely feed 3 mouths. How were they gonna manage 4? Still, pity won out over worry. Susan bustled around, settin' the little one down gentle-like. That night, though, she spilled her fears to Jim. "We're stretched thin as it is," she said. "Ain't no way we can keep another mouth to feed. Talkin' her in's one thing, but raisin' her? That's a whole nother beast." Jim knew the score, how could he not? But lookin' at that helpless little thing, he couldn't just turn away. He let out a long breath and made up his mind. "We'll figure it out," he said. "I'll work harder, cut extra wood each day. She can grow up alongside our boy, keep him company." And that's how the whole town of Pinewood got wind of it. Jim Tanner had taken in a baby girl. He didn't hide it neither, named her Maggie right then and there. Their son, Johnny Tanner, wasn't in good shape, always Eileen. Once Maggie was old enough to understand, she took it on herself to look after him, giving him his medicine, helping him get by day to day. With Maggie steppin' up, Susan got a breather. Truth be told, she started thinking maybe talking Maggie in was a stroke of luck. Bit by bit, she handed off more chores to the girl so she could focus on her sewing. Maggie, bless her heart, couldn't stand seeing her folks struggle. Every spare minute, she'd find some way to lighten their load. Whenever she had a free spell, she'd plop down next to Susan and learn the needle and thread. Turned out she had a real knack for it, picked it up fast and stitched better than most. Jim'd watch her, sensible as she was, and grin ear to ear. Seeing her grow up day by day, an idea started brewing in his head. As Maggie grew up, Jim watched her turn into a fine young woman, smart, hardworking and kind. One night, he sat down with Susan to chew over an idea that had been rattling around in his head. "What if we had Johnny marry Maggie?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "She's practically family already. Maybe if they tied the knot, Johnny's health might pick up some. And with him so weak, having Maggie there to look after him would ease my mind." Susan's eyes welled up at the thought. She dabbed at her tears with a handkerchief. "That boy's been breaking my heart since the day he was born," she said. "If that's the best we can do for him, then so be it. Let's pick a day and get it done." Jim let out a heavy sigh and nodded. "I'll handle the details. You talk to Maggie, make sure she's ready." The next day, Susan called Maggie into the house. She sat her down with a gentle look and spilled the plan. Maggie's cheeks went red as a beet. She thought about how Jim had saved her life, how both of them had raised her like their own. This little cabin was her home, and Johnny, well, she'd grown up with him, knew him inside and out. After a moment, she gave a shy nod. Johnny, though, wasn't so keen when he heard it. He'd always seen Maggie as a little sister, not a wife. Plus, he knew his own body better than anyone. He wasn't long for this world, and he didn't want to tie her down. Maggie caught wind of his hesitation, but she wasn't backing down. She marched right up to him and said, "We ain't blood, Johnny. I'm marrying you, and that's that. If I don't, I can't stay in this house anymore." That shook Johnny up good. "Don't talk crazy, sis," he blurted out. "Fine, I'll do it, just don't go doing anything rash." So they set a wedding date. But as the big day crept closer, Johnny's health took a nosedive. He could barely get out of bed. The doc came by, took one look, and shook his head. There wasn't much he could do. Jim and Susan fretted something fierce. They'd known this day might come, but facing it head-on still felt like a punch to the gut. Susan prayed every night, begging the Lord not to take her boy. Maggie, meanwhile, kept vigil by Johnny's bedside, day in and day out. But in the end, what they all dreaded came to pass. Right before he slipped away, Johnny grabbed Susan's hand and rasped, "Ma, after I'm gone, find Maggie a good man to marry. Don't let her waste away here." Then he closed his eyes for good. When Johnny passed, the whole house sank into gloom. Susan took it hardest. Looked like the life'd been sucked right out of her. She'd sit there all day staring at nothing. Jim still went out to chop wood like always, but he'd leave earlier and come back later, avoiding the heaviness at home. Maggie knew he couldn't stand seeing everyone so broken. Maggie was huttin' too, but she pulled herself together. This family was hers to look after now. She tended to Susan every day, and before the sun was even up, she'd fix breakfast for Jim to take up the ridge. Whenever she had a spare minute, she'd stitch up more embroidery to sell, trying to ease the burden however she could. But fate wasn't done with them yet. One stormy night, Jim went out to work like usual. He didn't come back. Maggie waited 2 days and a night, passing the cabin, but there was no sign of him. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore and ran to the town elder for help. The elder reckoned something was wrong and rounded up a posse of young fellas to scour the ridge. It didn't take long before they found trouble: a torn-up patch near a cliff, claw marks from some wild beast, and Jim's old axe lying in the dirt not far off. They figured he'd tumbled over the edge. A couple of the braver boys climbed down and, sure enough, found Jim at the bottom. He was gone, had been for a while. When they hauled him back up, Susan took one look, let out a wail, and fainted dead away. Maggie sobbed till she couldn't breathe, but she knew she had to hold it together. Susan needed her now more than ever, and Jim deserved a proper send-off. After Jim's passing, the Tanner house was hangin' by a thread. They'd already shelled out every last penny for Johnny's doctorin' and funeral, and now there wasn't a dime left for Jim's burial. Maggie was at her wits' end. How was she going to give her pa a proper goodbye? The town elder stepped in, bless his heart. He rallied the folks of Pinewood, and they chipped in what they could. Everybody knew the Tanners had it rough, so they scraped together enough to cover the costs. Maggie, tears streaming down her face, bowed low and thanked him with all she had. Then she stood tall and said, "We'll handle Pa's funeral together." The elder helped her up, patting her shoulder. "From here on out, you're not alone," he said. Maggie made up her mind right then. She'd work hard, not just to take care of Susan, but to pay back every cent the townsfolk had given.
Ma, che sait von de, carryin a bowl of porridge into Susan's room, itzometin, please.
Susan lay there on the bed, still as a stone. Maggie tried to prop her up, but Susan just stared ahead, eyes empty, letting Maggie move her like a rag doll.
"Maggie, don't bother," she mumbled.
Maggie fought back tears. It had been near 2 weeks since Jim's funeral, and Susan was still a shell of herself. How could Maggie not ache seeing her like this? Forcing a smile, she said, "Ma, why you gotta suffer so? Livin' well's what matters most. Pa and Johnny wouldn't want to see you this way." Susan didn't budge. Maggie kept going. "How about this? We head to the church, light some candles for Pa and Johnny, say a prayer for 'em?" At the word prayer, Susan finally stirred. She looked at Maggie, eyes swimming with tears, and gave a small nod. The next day, the two of them trudged to the little Pinewood church. On the way back, they passed a bakery, and Maggie figured she'd grab some pastries for Susan to try. She left Susan waiting by the roadside and ducked inside. Right then, Susan overheard some folks chatting nearby. She couldn't help but listen in. "You see that Tanner house?" one woman said. "Lost her son and her husband in a month flat. Folks are saying that adopted girl of hers is bad news, cursed they reckon."
"Don't talk nonsense," another snapped.
"She's a good girl, works hard. Ain't no curse about her." "I ain't saying it," the first shot back. "It's just what people whisper. And facts are facts, 2 dead in that house in no time. Who'd want to get mixed up with her now?" Maggie came bouncing back with the pastries just then, and the gossipers clammed up quick. She helped Susan along, not noticing how pale her ma had gone or the strange glint in her eyes. After that day, Susan started pulling herself together some. She'd even pick up her needlework again when she felt up to it, same as always. Only difference was, she barely paid Maggie any mind. She'd look at her with cold, hard eyes every day, like she was a stranger. Maggie figured Susan was just clawing her way out of grief, and seeing her perk up a bit eased her heart. She didn't dwell on it too much. Then one day, a plump woman showed up at the house. Susan welcomed her in like an old friend, then called Maggie over. The woman sized Maggie up from head to toe and grinned. "Your girl's a real beauty," she said to Susan. "A rare find round these parts. That young Mr. Carter from town's a lucky fella. I'll let his folks know." Maggie's got twisted. She had a hunch who this lady was. Sure enough, that night, Susan laid it out plain. "That was Mrs. Waller, the matchmaker from town," she said. "She's setting you up with Ethan Carter, the second son of the Carter family over at Evergreen Mill. He's taken a shine to you, wants you for a wife."
Maggie's heart sank.
She didn't know much about most folks, but Ethan Carter? She knew him, all right. A while back, she'd gone to town to sell her embroidery. Just as she stepped out of the shop, this fella blocked her path, sweet-talking her something fierce. She tried to brush him off, but he wouldn't let up. Lucky for her, a beggar stepped in, yanked him off, and gave her a chance to hightail it out of there. She'd thought he was just some no-good drifter and didn't give it another thought. But a few days later, a kind woman pulled her aside and clued her in. Turns out that creep was Ethan Carter, second son of the richest Millonan family in town. Word was, the Carters had lost their eldest boy to bandits on a trade run years back, so they'd pinned all their hopes on Ethan. Spoiled him rotten, given him whatever he wanted. Last time he'd hassled Maggie and didn't get his way, he'd taken it out on that poor beggar, beat him half to death. Seems the more he couldn't have something, the more he wanted it. He'd tracked Maggie down and sent the matchmaker to seal the deal. At first, Ethan's ma wasn't too keen on the match. With Maggie's reputation talking a hit around town, she figured her precious boy deserved better than some cursed girl. But Ethan wouldn't let it go. He kept nagging till she caved. To ease her mind, she insisted on checking their birth dates with the local fortune teller, just to make sure the stars lined up. Lo and behold, the old coot declared them a perfect pair. With no excuses left, Mrs. Carter grudgingly agreed. When Maggie heard the whole story, she dropped to her knees in front of Susan.
Ma, please, she begged. I don't wanna marry into the Carters.
Let me stay here and take care of you, ain't that enough? Susan just snorted, a bitter edge to her voice. Keep you around? I don't even know if I'd live through it. And what are you gonna do, support me with pocket lint? The Carters are offering $20 as a bride price. That's enough to pay off what we owe the town and leave me something to live on. It's settled, so hush up. Maggie felt like she'd been struck by lightning. She'd heard the whispers around Pinewood, folks blaming her for Johnny and Jim's deaths, but she never thought Susan believed them too. Worse, her own ma was tunning on her, ready to sell her off like livestock. Still, she couldn't give up. Tears streaming down her face, she pleaded, I'll work myself to the bone, ma. I'll find a way to keep us afloat.
Please don't send me to the Carters. Ethan ain't a good man.
No matter how she begged, Susan wouldn't budge. She'd made up her mind, Maggie was marrying into the Carter family, even if it killed her. Word spread fast, and soon the whole town was buzzing.
Folks sa it Maggot hits a jackpot. Sneglin a rich husband like Ethan Carter.
But deep down, Maggie knew this wasn't no stroke of luck, it was a trap. With Susan dead set on it though, she had no choice but to grit her teeth and go through with it. Come the wedding night, Ethan stumbled into the room, reeking of whiskey. He spotted Maggie sitting by the bed in her bridal getup and sneered. Well, ain't you the feisty one? Where's all that fight now? Looks like you're mine, good and proper. With that, he lunged at her. What was done, Maggie had to face it. She figured if she played the dutiful wife, maybe life wouldn't be so bad. But she was dead wrong. Ethan didn't see her as a wife, she was just a toy to him. He'd spend his days loafing around with his no-account buddies, drinking and carousing. If anything ticked him off, he'd come home and take it out on Maggie with his fists. She was worse off than a hired girl, least they got paid. When he went easy, Maggie'd swallow her tears and bear it. But when he laid into her hard, she'd run to her mother-in-law, begging for help. Mrs. Carter didn't give a lick, she'd just stand by while Ethan dragged Maggie back for another beating. The old man, Mr. Carter, had a shred more decency. Sometimes, when he heard Ethan wailing on her in the yard and Maggie's desperate cries echoing out, he'd shuffle over and chew his son out a little. Not that it did much good. Still, he saw Maggie wasn't just some punching bag. He told her to pitch in at the family's mill when she wasn't busy dodging Ethan's temper. That turned out to be a small mercy. Maggie threw herself into the work, learning the ins and outs of lumber, how to grade it, cut it, even turn it into something useful. She got darn good at it, too. Customers started a skin for her by name, swearing they'd only buy if Maggie handled their order. Old Mr. Carter was tickled pink. He knew Ethan was a lost cause, but his daughter-in-law? She was a keeper. Made him feel a mite better about the mess his family'd become. He told Ethan to lay off her some, treat her decent for once. For a spell, Maggie thought maybe things were looking up. Then came the thunderbolt. One day, Ethan was out in town, hitting on some married woman. Her husband caught wind of it and didn't take kindly to it. Fists flew, and next thing you know, Ethan's lying dead in the street. The Carters hauled the fella to court, but no amount of lawyering could bring their boy back. Mrs. Carter bawled her eyes out, wailing like the world was ending. When she laid eyes on Maggie, though, her grief turned to rage. You, she spat. You're the curse that took my son. In a fit, she scribbled out a divorce paper and booted Maggie out of the house. That very day, her 18th birthday, Maggie walked away from the Carter place with nothing but that paper in her hand. She'd been married less than a year. Heading back to Pinewood, she knocked on Susan's door. Susan heard what happened and stomped her foot in a fury, locking Maggie out cold. You ain't steppin' foot in here, she hollered. Maggie dropped to her knees outside, sobbing loud enough to wake the dead. I didn't kill him, Ma. I swear it, believe me. The folks of Pinewood gathered round, pointin' and whisperin' as Maggie knelt there, cryin' her heart out. Some took pity on her. Susan, come on now, one called through the door. Let the girl in. She can't keep kneelin' out here, it ain't right. Just let her inside and talk it out slow. A chorus of voices chimed in, folks who'd watched Maggie grow up. Susan didn't want to look like a heartless fool in front of the whole town, so she finally cracked the door open, grumbling under her breath. But she wasn't letting Maggie back into the main house. Instead, she shoved her toward the rickety old shed by the pig pen, a drafty broke-down thing used for storing junk, and told her to stay out of her sight. Maggie didn't hold it against her. Long as she had a roof over her head, she'd make do. She rolled up her sleeves and spent 3 days scrubbing that shed till it was livable. Today, she was fixin' to take some embroidery she'd been workin' on into town to sell. Steppin' out of the shed, she caught the tail end of the neighbors jawin' about her again. She didn't pay it no mind, just smiled, said her good mornings, and headed off. After all she'd been through, Maggie was more determined than ever. She'd survive on her own terms, married or not. Thinking it over, she let out a little laugh and kept walking straight ahead. What she didn't know was someone trailing behind her, quiet as a shadow. For the next few months, things settled into an uneasy peace. Susan's face stayed sour, but she didn't hassle Maggie much. Then one day, while Maggie was out in the yard feeding the chickens, a knock came at the gate. She ran over to open it, and there stood Mrs. Waller, the matchmaker, again. Maggie's eyelid twitched, but she let her in. Sure enough, Mrs. Waller was back with another proposal. This time, it was for a 26-year-old peddler named Lee Travis from the next town over. He lived with his old ma and couldn't offer much in the way of a bride price. His pockets were too shallow for that. Still, Susan said yes without blinking. Maggie'd had her fill of forced weddings after Ethan. She didn't want another mess endin' in folks pointin' fingers at her. Even though Susan pushed hard, Maggie put her foot down this time. "I ain't marrying him," she said flat out. The matter got shelved, but Lee wasn't one to take no for an answer. Using his peddlin' as an excuse, Lee started showing up in Pinewood regular-like. He'd linger by the Tanner place, peek in over the fence. When Maggie went to town to sell her stitchin', he'd tail her from a distance. Over time he got bolder, started bringin' a pound of meat to the door, claimin' it was a gift for Susan. Susan took a shine to him, mostly, 'cause she figured it'd mean less work for her if Maggie was out of the picture. One day, she invited Lee to stay for supper. Over the meal, Susan flipped her usual cold shoulder. She ladled out soup for Maggie, even piled some greens on her plate. Maggie's nose stung, and she nearly broke down right there. She couldn't figure why Susan was actin' so kind all of a sudden. "Eat up," Susan said, smilin' strange. Maggie dug in, but her head started spinning fast. Before long, she blacked out. When she came to, Lee Travis was lying next to her, fast asleep. It hit her like a ton of bricks what had happened. Lee woke up, eyes brimmin' with tears, and pulled her close. "You're mine now," he whispered, trying to sound gentle. "I'll treat you right from here on out, just marry me." What could Maggie say? Her heart sank, but the deed was done, she had to face it. A month later, she wed Lee Travis. The wedding day was quiet, hardly anyone showed up. Maggie figured it was 'cause the Travises were dirt poor, and kinfolk didn't bother making the trip. But after living with them a spell, she learned it wasn't that simple. One night, Lee trudged home late, haulin' his peddler's pack. Maggie peeked inside. Half the goods were still unsold. "How'd sellin' go today?" she asked. "Why're you back so late? Where you been?" Lee's face twisted up, and he snapped, "Don't you start nozzin' into my business, woman. Quit yappin', and rustle me up some grub." Maggie froze, then turned to fix his supper without another word. It wasn't that she didn't trust him, least not at first. But since they'd tied the knot, Lee kept pesterin' her for money, sayin' he needed it to stock his pack. She'd hand over every cent she made from her embroidery, thinkin' it was for their little family. Now though, his odd ways were settin' off alarm bells. Then she overheard some gossip in town. Lee wasn't just some poor peddler down on his luck. Back in the day, his pa had left him a decent chunk of cash, but Lee'd gambled it all away. Left him broke as a church mouse. His ma wasn't even alive no more, died years back. He'd earned a reputation as a lowlife, and no girl in his own town would touch him with a 10-foot pole. That's why he'd set his sights on Maggie, heard she was pretty and could earn a buck. Lee'd caught sight of Maggie one day while peddlin' his wares and couldn't get her out of his head. After pokin' around, he found out she wasn't just a looker, she could make money too. So he hightailed it to his ma, told her to get Mrs. Waller on the case, and set the wheels in motion. His ma, old and cooped up at home, didn't know Maggie from Adam. All she cared about was her boy finally settlin' down, so she gave the green light without a second thought. When Maggie realized what kind of family she'd married into, she cried herself sick. But the rice was cooked, she had to tough it out. A few days later, she started shadowing Lee when he went out. After tiling him for a spell, the truth hit her like a freight train. He'd peddle half the day, then blow the rest of it at the gambling den, till the sun went down. Night after night, he'd stumble home late, reeking of cheap whiskey. One evening, Maggie sat waiting in their cramped little room, ready to have it out with him. The second Lee walked in, she cut right to it. "Hand over what you made today," she said, arms crossed. Lee smirked, brushing her off. "Since when do I answer to you? I'm dog-tired from workin'. Where's my supper?" Maggie's temper flared. "Workin'? I reckon you've been workin' hard at the card table, ain't ya? Bet every dime sittin' pretty in that gambling den by now." That struck a nerve. Lee's eyes blazed, and he grabbed her chin hard. "You little sneak. You been following me." Even with her face smartin', Maggie didn't back down. She glared right back and said, "Darn right I followed you. Good thing too, turns out you ain't just losing what you make, but every cent I've scraped together for you too. Keep this up, and we're done for." She'd hoped her words'd shake some sense into him, get him to quit the gambling for good. But Lee just threw his head back and laughed. "Done for? You think you can run back to your ma's place and cry about it? Let's get one thing straight, if Susan hadn't helped me that night, I wouldn't have landed you so easy. You think she'd take you back now?" Hearing it straight from his mouth cut Maggie deep, though she'd half suspected it already. Still, she wasn't giving in. "Maybe I'll find out," she shot back. "You keep gambling, and I'll be on the street before I stick with you." Lee's got twisted, he knew she meant it. Since they'd hitched, Maggie's embroidery had been pullin' in steady money, sometimes more than his peddlin'. She was his golden goose, and he couldn't afford to lose her. Softening his tone, he begged, "I didn't mean it, all right? I just got mad. I'm scared you'll leave me high and dry. I messed up, I swear I'll quit gamblin'." Maggie bought his sob story and let it slide. But a few days later, he was back at it, rollin' in later than ever. Before long, he'd cleaned out every last penny they had. Maggie saw he was a lost cause. She told him to write up a divorce paper and set her free, end it clean. Lee wouldn't hear of it. He'd dig in his heels, and when they fought hard, he'd smack her around. His ma, Mrs. Travis, didn't lift a finger to stop him. She'd just pile on, cussin' Maggie out right alongside him. Maggie couldn't take it no more. She started packing her things, ready to walk away for good. Just then, Lee keeled over out of nowhere, hitting the floor like a sack of potatoes. She figured it was some trick to guilt her into stayin', so she ignored him. But Mrs. Travis kept shaking him, hollerin' his name, and he wouldn't stir. Panic crept in, and Maggie ran to fetch the doc. The old Sawbones came, poked around, but couldn't pin down what was wrong. He scribbled out a prescription and told them to give it a day. Lee downed the pills for a few days, but nothing changed. He just lay there, out cold. Maggie knew this couldn't go on. Lee might be a louse, but he was still a living soul. She turned to Mrs. Travis. "I'm headin' to town to find a better doc," she said. Mrs. Travis, half out of her mind with worry, nodded and let her go. Maggie tracked down a proper doctor and dragged him back to the house. But the second they stepped inside, Mrs. Travis's wails hit him like a wall. "My poor boy. Why'd you have to go? What am I supposed to do now?" Maggie froze. The doc took one look, muttered something about bad luck, and hightailed it out of there, scared of catching whatever jinx was floating around.
Mrs. Travis spun on Maggie, wild-eyed.
"You killed my boy, you wretch. If you hadn't left, he wouldn't have passed out like that."
"Jure Stein hier tu me gedreit." Maggies Eis wellet ab.
"I'm so sorry, Ma," she choked out. "I never meant for this. Don't worry, I'll figure out a way to bury him proper." Mrs. Travis wasn't having it. Bury him and call it quits?
Watte baut I lost my son, WHY schuld die so alone.
She pounded her chest, sobbing like a banshee. Maggie remembered how Susan had gotten $20 from the Carters, paid off the debts and kept some to live on. If she could scrape together $20 for Mrs. Travis, maybe that'd settle things. Problem was, she didn't have a nickel to her name. Where was she gonna get that kind of cash? Mrs. Travis clocked Maggie's hesitation and pounced. She grabbed her by the skirt, yenkin hard. "You owe me for my boy's life," she screeched. "Pay up, or I'll march right over to your ma's and raise hell." Maggie swallowed hard, choking back her anger. In a pinch, she blurted out, "All right, Ma, don't fret. I'll scrape together $20 for you somehow." Mrs. Travis's eyes lit up at that. "You said it," she snapped. "If I don't see that money by tomorrow, I'm headin' to Susan's. Mark my words." Maggie was cornered. Desperate, she racked her brain for a way to rustle up cash quick. Only one idea stuck: sellin' herself. She couldn't stomach the thought of workin' the saloons, so that left bein' a kept woman for some rich fella. Before dawn the next day, Maggie scratched out a sign sayin' "For sale, willing worker," and trudged to the busiest corner in town. She set the sign down, dropped to her knees, and waited for someone to bite. It didn't take long. A crowd gathered, pointin' and whisperin'. Maggie didn't care who laughed. She lifted her head high, lettin' him get a good look. Soon enough, a middle-aged man in fancy duds, Mr. Norton, a big shot around town, squinted at her, then pulled out $20 without a second thought. Maggie started to stand, countin' the bills, when Mrs. Travis barreled out of nowhere. She snatched the money clean out of Maggie's hands, shoved a bundle of Maggie's things at her, and crowed, "I got the cash. My boy's business is done, you're off the hook. Go on with your new boss." Then she bolted like a jackrabbit. Mr. Norton, figuring Maggie might run too, grabbed her arm tight. She couldn't shake him off, she was stuck. Just then, a beggar pushed through the crowd hollerin', "Hey girl. Your husband ain't dead, I just saw him haulin' some gal back to your place." Maggie's jaw dropped. The beggar yanked Mr. Norton's grip loose and yelled, "Go check it out, hurry or you'll miss it." Mr. Norton cussed and swung at the beggar, but the fella held firm, giving Maggie her shot. She hiked up her skirts and ran like the wind back to the Travis house, not looking back. It didn't take long to get there. She crept up and peeked through a crack in the window. Sure enough, there was Lee, alive and kickin', sittin' with some woman countin' a stack of bills. It was the same $20 Maggie'd just sold herself for. Mrs. Travis stood by, grinnin' ear to ear. The woman finished tallin' and smirked. "Yep, $20, right as rain." Lee cackled. "Can you believe it? I made a quick 20 off her." "Blame her for wantin' to leave," he added. "If she'd stuck around, I wouldn't have had to pull this." The woman scowled. "You sure you ain't sweet on her? If you're so torn up, I'll clear out."
Lee backpedalet fast.
"No way.
She don't hold a candle to you.
If I gave a lick about her, would I be usin' her money to buy you out of that saloon? Come on now." That smoothed things over. The woman cozied up to him, right in front of Mrs. Travis, who just spat on the floor and turned away.
Maggie heard it all, and the piece clicked into place.
She spun around and hightailed it to the sheriff's office, ready to turn the whole rotten bunch in. The sheriff didn't waste time. He sent deputies to round up Lee, his ma, and the saloon gal. They hauled him in, and it didn't take much prodding before they spilled everything. A few days later, the judge laid down the law. Not only did he nail Lee for fraud, but he handed that $20 back to Maggie to boot. The judge filled her in on the dirty details. Turns out, that woman Lee brought home was a saloon girl he'd been sweet on for ages. He'd been blowing Maggie's hard-earned cash at the gambling den near the saloon, and one day, he hit a lucky streak. Scared Maggie'd catch on, he didn't dare stay out late. But on his way home, that gal roped him in, playing him like a fiddle till he followed her inside. For days, Lee quit the cards and poured every dime into her. When he ran dry, he hatched a plan to buy her freedom. Thing was, Mr. Norton, the rich fella who just bought Maggie, had his eye on the same gal. So Lee cooked up a scheme, trick Maggie into selling herself, pocket the cash, and use it to snatch the saloon girl out from under Norton's nose. 2 birds, 1 stone. Maggie could hardly believe the filth she'd been tangled up in. She clenched her teeth, took the $20, and walked out of that courtroom a free woman. With that $20 in her pocket, Maggie didn't head back to Pinewood. She'd had enough of Susan's cold shoulder and the town's wagon tongues. Instead, she rented a little shop in town, a cramped spot, sure, but it was hers. She set her sights on opening a tailoring business, figuring all those years of stitchin' ought to pay off. She was dead set on making a livin' for herself, no handouts needed. While she was fixin' up the shop, Maggie put out feelers to track down that beggar who'd tipped her off about Lee. Without him, she'd be stuck as Mr. Norton's kept woman by now. After a skin around and hitting dead ends, she finally got a lead. Word was, after she'd run off that day, Norton had his boys rough the fella up bad. He'd been laid up ever since, nursing his wounds. One day, Maggie grabbed some pastries and hunted him down. When she found him, the beggar froze, staring at her like he'd seen a ghost. "You're Sam Hill, ain't ya?" she asked after a bit of talking. "From Pinewood." Sam nodded slow. Turns out he was born and bred in Pinewood too. Lost his folks young and ended up begging on the streets in town. Years back, he'd gone days without a crumb, figuring he was done for. Wantin' to die where he'd started, he dragged himself to the edge of Pinewood and passed out cold. That's when Maggie'd stumbled across him, gave him a biscuit and some water, waited till he came around, then left without a fuss. Ever since, Sam'd kept an eye on her. Whenever she came to town to sell her embroidery, he'd trail behind, watching her back. That day Ethan Carter hassled her, it was Sam who'd stepped in and pulled him off. After she'd married Lee, Sam'd pegged him for trouble right off and stuck close, worrying she'd get hurt. When Lee'd pulled his fake death stunt, Sam'd been poking around the Travis place to figure it out. He'd spotted Lee sneaking that saloon gal in and hightailed it to warn Maggie. Hearing all this, Maggie's heart swelled. Nobody'd ever looked out for her like that, steady and quiet. She didn't waste time. "Sam, come work with me at the shop," she said. "We'll make it together." The little tailoring business started small, but with both of them pouring their all into it, it took off. A few years down the line, Maggie brought up something big. "Sam," she said one night, "how about we get hitched?" Sam couldn't believe his ears. "Me? Marry you?" he stammered. "Maggie, you're too good for the likes of me. Long as I can stick by you, I'll do whatever you need, no need for fancy promises." Maggie's eyes teared up, and she broke into a sobbing laugh. After they tied the knot, life turned sweet, full of little spats and big joys. Over the years, Maggie'd swing by Pinewood now and then to check on Susan. She'd let go of the old hurts, Susan's betrayal, the cold years. Susan saw how Maggie's days got better and better after marrying Sam, and the gossip about her being cursed faded away. Things between them never went back to how they were when Maggie was a kid, but at least the ice thawed some. The hatchet was buried, more or less. Maggie even floated the idea of bringing Susan to live with them in town, but Susan waved it off, maybe out of guilt, maybe something else. Maggie didn't push. She'd just drop in when she could, keeping the peace. This story's a reminder, there's a rainbow after the rain. Life ain't always pretty like we dream it up to be, it's full of hard knocks and no ways out. But if you dig deep and stand strong, you can bust through the chains holding you down. Maggie did it with grit and gumption, carving out the life she wanted. We can too, in our own way. That wraps up our first tale. Stick around for the next one, another folk story called The Wife's Strange Ways. Picture this. A husband sneaks a peek through a busted window one night, scared out of his wits, and takes off running into a foggy bone-chillin' winter dawn. This morning, out in the cold, Tom Faraday's trudging home alone. A few days back, he'd been fixin' a roof for some folks out of town. Now the job's done, and he's looking forward to a few days' rest. Through the thick fog, he spots an old chapel by the road, door hanging open. A baby's wail cuts through the quiet. Tom stops short. "A baby out here in the middle of nowhere," he mutters, picking up his pace toward the chapel. Inside, he finds a woman crumpled on the floor, a little one in her arms, crying its lungs out. He checks her breath, she's long gone. Probably some poor soul fleeing trouble, gave birth out here, and didn't make it. Tom's heart twists. He scoops up the pitiful bundle and heads home, figuring he can't just leave it there to die. Tom Faraday's wife had passed a few years back, leaving him on his own. He'd been rattling around that empty house ever since, so talking in this little bundle felt like a spark of life again. He named the boy Charlie Faraday, figuring it'd be something to hold on to, like a bit of warmth in a cold world. Charlie grew up quick, a spitfire of a kid, always running wild and stirring up trouble. Tom took it all in stride, loving him like his own flesh and blood, never once complaining. Time slipped by quiet-like, and in a blink, Charlie was 18, a strapping young man. Over those years, Tom's health started slipping. He'd spend more days laid up in bed than out fixin' roofs. Charlie, meanwhile, had picked up a trade workin' with clay down at the potter's shed near Pinewood's old quarry. He'd teamed up with some buddies there, learnin' the ropes. One noon, Charlie came barlin' home, grinnin' like a fool. Tom, propped up in bed, clocked his boy's mood right off. "What's got you so chipper today, son?" he rasped. "You run into some gal down at the shed?" Charlie scratched his head, bashful. "You got me, Pa," he chuckled. "I met Ellie, old man Cooper's daughter, down at the quarry. We're fixin' to get engaged. Couldn't wait to tell you first, I'm over the moon." He went on, ramblin' soft about Ellie's good points, her laugh, her quick hands with the clay. Tom nodded, a smile creasin' his weathered face. "You're at that age, Charlie," he said. "Me, I'm gettin' on, body's not what it used to be. I might not live to see you settle down proper, so let's make it quick while I'm still kickin'. That's my last wish in this world." Charlie grabbed Tom's hand tight, eyes sherneen with tears. "Don't talk like that, Pa. You gotta hang on. Once Ellie and me tie the knot, we'll be by every day, you'll see." Tom's sickness only got worse, though. After talking it over with Ellie, Charlie decided to speed things up and set a wedding date pronto. But as the year wound down, money got tight at the Faraday place. Charlie couldn't stand seeing Tom suffer without proper care, so he kissed Ellie goodbye and headed out to the frontier to pick up work, anything to bring home some cash. Ellie stayed behind, tending to Tom like he was her own kin. When the new year rolled around, Charlie came trudging back, a sack of coins slung over his shoulder and a spring in his step. But the second he crossed the threshold, he stopped dead. There in the doorway to his room stood a woman, hair all mussed, dressed in a tight patched-up shift. Her face was smudged with dirt, and she looked half-panicked. She could have been Ellie's twin, 7 or 8 parts the same, at least. Charlie's heart skipped. "Who in tarnation are you?" he hollered. "Why do you look like my Ellie?" The woman locked eyes with him, her face lighten up with something like relief. "Tom Faraday," she said, voice rough as gravel, "I owe your family a debt. Your pa saved me in that chapel years back. I'm here to pay it back, wearing a human shape." Charlie's head spun. She'd called him by name, his full name, like she knew him. "Saved you," he sputtered. "I don't even know you. Who are you?" She gave a faint, crooked smile and didn't answer straight. Instead, she brushed past him into the house, fetching hot water and medicine for Tom, who was laid out feverish on his cot. She moved careful, tending to him like it was second nature. Charlie watched, jaw slack. She moved just like Ellie, every gesture a mirror image. Over the next few days, this stranger stuck around the Faraday place. She nursed Tom, scrubbed the floors, cooked supper, kept the whole house running. Only thing off about her was how much she loved soaking in the washtub, spent hours in there every day. Charlie noticed something else too, a faint fishy stink clinging to her, no matter how much she washed. It set his nerves on edge. This gal wasn't right, and he aimed to find out why. One night, she hauled a bucket of water into the washroom again. Charlie'd had enough of wondering. He crept after her, hiding in the shadows, determined to get to the bottom of it. What kind of woman looked so much like his Ellie, and what was she hiding? He pressed up to the window, peering through a busted slat. The sight near made him holler. A long scaly tail slithered out of the tub, flicking in the air. She wasn't human, she was some kind of monster. Charlie spun on his heel and bolted back to the house, heart pounding like a drum. That night, Charlie rounded up a handful of sturdy fellas from Pinewood, armed to the teeth with pitchforks and clubs. They stormed into the yard, circling the house to trap whatever that thing was inside. Charlie kicked the door open and found her sitting calm as you please by Tom's bedside, like she didn't have a care in the world. "You snake in the grass." Charlie bellowed, brandishing a stick. "Quit playing human, what did you do to my Ellie?" The creature didn't flinch. She just looked up, cool as a cucumber, and said, "Years ago, you scared me half to death out there. I'm here to pay back your family's kindness." Charlie blinked, thrown off. Turns out, she was talking about something from way back. Not him but Tom. Long ago, when Tom found baby Charlie in that chapel, there'd been a little rattlesnake coiled up nearby, caught by a hunter's trap. Tom'd cut it loose, figuring it didn't deserve to die neither, and went on his way. That snake didn't forget. Over the years, hundreds she reckoned, she'd scratched out a life in the wild, dodging trouble. Eventually, She'd learned some kind of trick to take on a human shape, to repay the Faraday family for setting her free. She'd tracked Tom down, only to find him Eileen and Charlie off workin' the frontier. "I didn't mean no harm," she said, her voice steady. "I came quiet like, hopin' to help without stirrin' up a fuss. But seein' your pa so sick, and you gone over the new year, I couldn't leave him alone. I swear, I just wanted to get y'all through." Her face softened, almost sad-like. Charlie pieced it together. This wasn't some devil come to snatch Ellie. It was that dang snake, tryin' to square a debt. He felt a fool, scarin' up a posse over it. Droppin' his stick, he mumbled, "Sorry ma'am, I got it all wrong." The fellas with him lowered their weapons too, touched by her story. A monster wantin' to do right, it wasn't something you heard every day. They eased up, letting the tension drain out of the room. After the new year passed, Tom's health started perkin' up, thanks to her tending him day and night. Charlie and Ellie could finally breathe easy and get back to planning their weddin'. One morning, while Charlie was sweeping the yard, he caught sight of her again. Her human shape was fading, melting away right before his eyes. In its place was a big OL rattlesnake, coiled up on the ground. "Tom Faraday," a low voice rumbled in his head, "I've passed my test. My time's up, I can't hold this form no more. Gotta go back to being what I am." Charlie stared as she explained. She'd been pushing herself hard to stay human, and it had worn her plumb out. "Thanks for looking after your pa these past days," she said. "I'm done here." With that, the rattler shook its head, slithered out of the yard, and vanished down the path into the fields. Charlie watched her go, a mess of feelings churning in his chest. Tom got better under her care, and soon enough, Charlie wed Ellie like he'd promised. The Faraday house settled into a quiet, happy rhythm. Tom hung on till he got to meet his first grandson, then passed peaceful-like a few years later. Charlie took it hard, but he didn't let it break him. He'd catch himself thinking about that snake woman more'n he cared to admit. Her selflessness stuck with him, a lesson in paying it forward. 16 winters later, on a frosty night, Charlie had a dream. A big rattler coiled up in his mind, whispering cryptic-like, "Come mornin', you ever been to Willow Creek?" New folks just rolled in. He woke with a start, shaken off the chill. That voice, it was her, no doubt about it. He mulled it over, then figured he'd follow the nudge. Next day, he hitched up the wagon and rode out to Willow Creek, a little settlement just over the ridge. Wandering through the narrow lanes, Charlie bumped into a young couple who'd just moved in. The gal stopped him cold. She looked near identical to Ellie from back in the day, same spark in her eyes. It was like seeing a ghost. They hit it off right away, and before he knew it, they'd set a wedding date. Turns out, she was Ellie reborn, least that's what Charlie reckoned. One life, two loves, tied together by some twist of fate. He and this new Ellie, call her Ella, picked up where he'd left off, growing old hand in hand. They raised a passel of kids, scrappin' by but happy as clams. Charlie Faraday reckoned the best thing he ever did was sit round with his grandkids, tellin' him tales. He'd gather 'em up by the hearth and spin the yarn about his two lives, how a dream from a rattlesnake led him back to his lost love. Every time he got to that part, the kids giggle and holler, swearing up and down they'd find a love like that someday, one that hit him square at first sight. Charlie and Ella'd catch each other's eye across the room and share a quiet smile, hands clasped tight. Their life was full to burstin', no regrets left to carry. They'd weathered the storms and come out stronger, surrounded by kin and a heap of good memories. That's the end of this tale, folks. If you liked what I shared, drop a note down below. Don't forget to subscribe and pass it along, means the world to me. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch y'all in the next one. And there you have it, the whole kit and caboodle. We started with Maggie Tanner, a girl who clawed her way out of hardship with nothing but her own two hands. She faced down a cursed reputation, a rotten husband, and a ma who turned her back, only to build a life worth living with Sam Hill by her side. Then we rolled into Tom Faraday's story, picking up a baby and a debt from a rattlesnake that came full circle for his boy Charlie. Through thick and thin, Charlie found his Ellie twice over. Proven fate's got a funny way of tying loose ends. Both tales show you what's what. Life will throw you curveballs, knock you flat, and leave you wondering how you'll get up. But if you've got the grit to keep swinging, there's light at the end of the tunnel. Maggie and Charlie didn't let the world break them. They stood tall and made their own happy endings. So that's it for now. 2 stories down, and plenty more where that came from. Next time, we'll dig into something fresh, maybe a ghost yarn or a frontier mystery. Stick around, and we'll find out together. Till then, y'all take care.